I'm free from the shackles of university once more, and like any self-respecting university student, I immediately put questionable amounts of substances in my body to celebrate. But that got me thinking, what kind of mind-altering stuff did our ancient ancestors lose their brain cells on? Well, that's what we'll be looking at today, specifically with my favorite alcoholic civilization, the Romans. And just to be clear, the Romans did have all kinds of medical and religious related uses for all kinds of drugs and plants, but I'll be focusing mostly on the recreational use. Now, let's begin. Alright, let's start with the most obvious and ubiquitous substance of the ancient Mediterranean. Alcohol of some form has been made for thousands of years and was independently created across the world, yada yada, you get the point. But what alcohols did the Romans have access to? Well, obviously wine, but as any fancy, smug prick will tell you, not all wine is created equal, and the Romans definitely had their favorites. White wines were typically the more fancy and expensive ones, and if we take Pliny the Elder's word for it, then Falernian wine was good for your stomach, but not nerves, and Alban wine was good for your nerves, but not stomach. However, Sarrentine wine had no bad effects, but the personal favorite wine of Emperor Augustus was Sætine, or Rhaetic wine if we believe Suetonius' writings instead. These fancy wines were usually aged between 5 to 20 years in these big amphora clay jugs, and the wines were typically just named after the area they were made in, like Falernian wine being made from the vineyards of Mount Falernus, which today is Mount Massico, which still has vineyards, so I guess this wine still kind of exists. But anyways, going back to the ancient Falernian wine, this was arguably the most prestigious wine of the Roman aristocracy throughout the empire's golden years, and it was supposedly one of the strongest. Pliny even says it was flammable, so this would mean it had an alcohol by volume percentage of close to or over 50%, but I gotta say, I'm extremely doubtful of that being true, because that's an insane number for a wine. But dangerous levels of alcohol content aside, this doesn't matter too much since wine in the Greco-Roman world was almost always very watered down. Now, watered down booze today is an absolute travesty as we all know, but back then it made some sense. For one, the Romans drank wine basically every day if it was available, so you don't accidentally want to get a little too tipsy, right? But the more important reason is because wine was used to purify water. The alcohol would of course help disinfect the water a little, but also add flavor, which I mean, yeah, the water in urban areas before modern purification methods probably tasted like shit. But there was also a cultural reason for this, as drinking pure undiluted wine was seen as degenerate low-life behavior, even barbaric. After all, the Gauls and Persians drank pure wine, and you wouldn't want to be like those savages, would you, right? Now, of course, you could drink undiluted wine, which they refer to as merum, but ancient wines were less pure and more viscous, kind of like a syrup, so maybe adding some water was for the best. If this all sounds unappealing, don't worry, the Romans had plenty of recipes for adding extra flavors, like spices, herbs, and even seawater, in case it was a little too sweet. But the mixture I think sounds the best is the Roman Muslim wine, a mixture of wine and honey, which I will be testing here right now. Now, the Roman poet Martial said the best Muslim wine was a mixture of Falernian wine and Attica honey. Unfortunately, I don't have either of those, but I got the next best thing. This cheap $11 Quebec wine and generic honey. And there we have it, our lovely discounted Muslim wine. Let's give it a little test. Pretty good, not gonna lie. Okay, we get it. This is what the fancy smancy rich people drink. But what about the brokies? Well, for them, they get their own cheaper wine substitutes, such as Laura, which was made from the waste scraps from regular wine production, like all the grape skins and seeds. So they take this slop, let it soak in water for a few days, then press and strain it and let the liquid ferment. This bottom tier slop liquid was typically given to slaves or other poor brokies. Although the Roman writer Varro says that old women like it apparently, so okay. It also wasn't uncommon among the soldiers. But speaking of soldiers, another common poor people drink that was common within the army was Polska. And if the Astoria Augusta is to be believed for once, then even Emperors Trajan and Hadrian drank this liquid with their soldiers. So what is Polska? It's water and wine vinegar, and I've already prepared a little right here. Oh, that's terrible. Plebeian slop aside, the Romans also had countless different religious and medicine-related usages for these wines. Far too many to go over right now. But hey, some of you may be thinking, all this wine stuff is cool and all, but I'm more of a beer man. Well, luckily for you, the empire had plenty of wheat and barley, and therefore a lot of beers all across the provinces, like Egyptian Zoutum, Iberian Calia, and Gallic Croatia. And for you ladies, all 5 of you, you can use the beer foam as a facial cream. At least that's what Pliny says. But what did the fancy, aristocratic Roman writers have to say about beer? Well, it's usually not very positive. Typically, they just associate it as a drink for northern barbarians, while accusing them of being dipshit alcoholics. Tacitus even refers to beer as vini corruptus. Man, I wonder what that could mean. Okay, so it's very clear the Roman upper classes didn't like beer, but that sure as hell didn't stop everyone else. Now, the only known Roman-era brewery found on the Italian peninsula dates sometime between the 5th and 6th century AD in Macerata. However, this was most likely because of the beer-loving Ostrogoths that controlled Italy at the time. But this isn't to say there was zero beer production in Roman Italy prior to this. It just definitely wasn't the most common thing. Wine was king here after all. But outside the peninsula, beer was commonly brewed, minus the Greek areas, they were also wine snobs, but in Iberia, Egypt, and basically the entire north, beer was super common. And we know this not just because the Romans themselves said so, because there's a bunch of ancient brewery sites found. Although, as the empire expanded its Greco-Roman culture to more territories, the popularity of wine increased, especially among the Gallic elites. But beer never just went away of everyone else, and especially not within the army. Beer would gradually become more common within the army. As more and more men started to be recruited from the northern provinces, they obviously brought their love of fermented grain slop with them. Plus, I mean, if your choices were between beer and vinegar water, what would you choose? Speaking of slop, we can even get a rough idea of which beers were considered lower than others. During Emperor Diocletian's price caps in 301 AD, it says a pint of Egyptian beer was 2 denarii, but a pint of Gallic or Pannonian beer was 4 denarii. To be clear, they're actually measuring in sextarias, but if we round it down slightly, it's basically the same as a British pint. Okay, well, maybe you're not a fan of fermented piss water either, but luckily there is a sweeter yellow liquid you can try, hydromel, or as you call it today in English, mead. It's simply fermented honey and water, with maybe some extra spices if you're feeling fancy. Sweet and tasty, and was certainly a well-liked drink, but was never going to be truly massive like wine or beer, since, it's a lot harder to mass-produce bees than it is grapes and wheat. But the thing I find the most silly about hydromel was its many medical-related uses. Pliny gives a ton of different remedies for all kinds of illnesses that involve hydromel. The obvious things like stomach aches and infections, and this makes some sense, honey does have real health benefits. However, he also recommends its use in treating epilepsy. Pliny actually says a lot of different things to treat epilepsy, like oxymel, which is vinegar and honey. He also says to eat bear testicles. Now look, I'm no doctor, but I don't think that's gonna work for a neurological disorder. But anyways, I think we've looked at enough alcohol for today, so what other mind-altering stuff can I consume large quantities of? Now, full disclosure, everything I previously said about Roman alcohol comes from a bunch of different sources I pieced together because alcohol is mentioned like a million times in Roman writings, so there's plenty of information to pull from. But for other substances, like marijuana, information is a bit more difficult to find. So for this section, most of the information is coming from this book, Cannabis in the Ancient Greek and Roman World by Alan Sumler. Now, like any fine, upstanding Canadian, I'm quite familiar with the devil's lettuce, or as I like to call it, the funny plant. But all across Asia, you can find cannabis plants in the wild, from Pakistan to Vietnam. And humans have been using the fibers made from these plants for thousands of years to make things like rope or fabric. We also know ancient Asian civilizations 100% consumed the wacky kush for thousands of years. So like everything in ancient Asia, it inevitably spread to the Mediterranean world via trade routes. Cannabis fibers were then used for fabrics in Bronze Age Egypt and Mesopotamia, before eventually making their way to the Greco-Roman world in the following centuries. I mean, the word cannabis is literally Latin, so clearly they knew. But the first explicit mention of the plant in Greek writings is from everyone's favorite drifter, Herodotus. In his writings, he mentions that the Scythians, as part of a funerary ritual, would cleanse themselves in a vapor bath tent by burning cannabis until the smoke got them feeling a little silly. So basically just ancient hotboxing. And in 2015, a Scythian burial site was discovered to have traces of cannabis residue in a cup. So I guess Herodotus was right. But let's skip ahead to the Roman era. Here, once again, our boy Pliny the Elder gives us more information. Pliny mentions cannabis being used for ropes and fabrics, as well as medicine. In fact, that's how most Roman writers talk about cannabis, just as it's used for fabrics and medical stuff. Specifically, cannabis water being used for ear infections is mentioned a lot for some reason. But we're here for the recreational fun. Unfortunately, explicit mentions of recreational use of cannabis among the Greco-Romans themselves are a bit rare. However, we have a few details along with some other information we can use to piece together a bigger picture. The 4th century BC poet Aphippus mentions in a fragment of his work the use of cannabis cakes served to guests at the symposiums. For reference, the Greek or Roman symposia was basically a fancy party hosted in a special room where people ate, drank, and talked about whatever it is that rich people talk about. Now, the 2nd century Roman doctor, Galen, also mentions cannabis being dried and used in desserts. Now, it doesn't explicitly say anything about psychoactive shenanigans from these desserts, but Galen also says cannabis tastes foul, so I don't think they were making these ancient edibles for the flavor, to say the least. So as we can see, recreational use of cannabis was a known thing among the Romans, although it's not clear how common it was. But we do know cannabis was ubiquitous enough that people saw it in their dreams, since the 2nd century AD dream interpreter Artemidorus Daldianius wrote about its meaning in dreams. We also know cannabis must have been fairly common at Roman markets, particularly because it's used frequently in medicine, but also because cannabis is included in Emperor Diocletian's price edicts. Last thing I'll add is that some medicine recipes included mixing cannabis and wine, so even though that's supposed to be medicinal, let's be real, an easy to buy or grow psychoactive plant mixed with alcohol, there's no way some people weren't using this for a bit more than medicine, you know? So although cannabis was most likely not as common as things like alcohol, it still had its uses. But maybe you want something a bit stronger than lame hippie grass. Oh boy, here's the part where YouTube may freak out, and that makes me a bit worried. If only there was a strange substance I could use to calm down and take away all my worries. Oh my gods, Marcus Aurelius, what are you doing here?
Bibeok, barbaresimia.
I have no idea what you just said, but okay. This tastes terrible, but now I suddenly feel all wonderful. So, opium poppy is quite the valuable plant today, mainly for the sticky latex harvested from the plant that is used for pharmaceutical production, like morphine and codeine, but also the illegal heroin trade. The seeds are fine though, you can put them on bagels and stuff. Funnily enough, the opium poppy plant is in the same genus as the little red poppy flowers we use on Remembrance Day, although these ones don't produce any wacky drugs, but anyways. Opium poppy has been cultivated for thousands of years, long before the Romans, especially in Mesopotamia, where it was cultivated by basically every civilization in the region, like the Sumerians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and even Egyptians. But skipping ahead to the Roman era, by that time opium was a well-known ingredient in countless different medical recipes, using controlled amounts in the forms of capsules, lozenges, or just pure opium latex mixed into wine. But regardless, they'd use opium to treat tons of different things like chronic pains, coughing, dysentery, and insomnia. But the most extreme medical use for opium was, how do I say this on YouTube? Terminally ill people use it to off themselves. Pliny even gives a specific example of a random commander in Spain doing exactly that after he could no longer handle whatever illness he had. I guess these days he would just use the pod. But this all shows that the Romans were well aware of the effects and dangers of opium. Now let's say you're a time traveler that wants to buy some Roman opium. Well, don't worry, since it was a common medical substance, you could buy it at the markets, but just be careful, as there's plenty of people selling fake opium. Luckily for you, the Romans had their trusted dealers as well. They say the Saplasia district in the city of Capua was where you'd go to get high quality stuff, including opium. However, this video is mostly about the recreational use of substances, and Roman writings mention opium almost exclusively in the context of medicine. So there isn't a whole lot I can say about it, but various Roman writers do say that frequent use of opium requires increasing dosage sizes. So this suggests that some people were probably using opium a bit more than they should be. Plus, opium was easy to buy at Roman markets, and if people today get addicted to gooning of all things, there's no way some people weren't nodding off on this stuff. Speaking of opioid addicts, the wacky medical concoction Teriac that Emperor Marcus Aurelius drank very regularly for his chronic pains 100% contained opium. And we know this because his top physician, Galen, literally describes how to make it. Galen also says Marcus would take his Teriac with that opium if he felt tired during his work, but if he struggled to sleep at night, he consumed the opium version. Galen also said Marcus used Teriac habitually. And Cassius Dio says Marcus needed Teriac to cope with his chronic stomach and chest pains while out on the front lines. Not sleeping and suddenly struggling to function without the wacky opium drink? Now that sounds a lot like withdrawal symptoms, doesn't it? And that's exactly what Thomas Africa argued in his little paper back in 1961. But as funny as it would be if the philosopher king was just some junkie, the theory has some issues. For one, if Marcus was truly chronically addicted to opium, then the dosages of the drug in his teriac would need to keep increasing over time. But there's no indication from Galen that he was doing that. In fact, if we use the estimates given by Francois Retief, then Galen's teriac would, on average, only contain between 1.5 to 3.3 milligrams of concentrated opium, which is significantly below the 50 milligrams it takes an average person to get particularly high on it. And that's not including the tolerance a supposed chronic addict would have built up. And as for the withdrawal symptoms, well, that can be partially explained by Marcus's lifelong chronic illnesses, which could have been literally anything, but it is a consistent detail about his life. All this could suggest Marcus relied on opium as a mild painkiller or even antidepressant, and any dependency he had was more psychological rather than a physical addiction. Although it is possible Galen's teriac still could have had higher dosages of opium added, and if that's true, then a more chronic physical addiction is very possible, but without more specifics, it's still just speculation. So I think we should move on to a substance that's less mind-numbing and more mind-frying. That's right, it's Psychosis netmere plant time, baby! Now, the more botany-inclined people probably recognize this plant as highly toxic, and you'd be correct. Henbane is most famous for being used as a poison, but it also had use in ancient medicine recipes in small amounts. Our boy, Pliny the Elder, and Pedonius Dioscorides both describe henbane being used for medical recipes to treat things like coughing up blood and disorders of the womb, whatever that means. Dioscorides identifies 3 different henbane species: the black henbane, white henbane, and yellow henbane. He then goes on to describe different medical uses for each of them, but to avoid black henbane for being too dangerous. These are real henbane species, but for the most part, all of them are of near equal toxicity, so I'll be treating them as one for this video. Now, unfortunately, we don't have direct references to henbane used recreationally, and it seems unlikely it would have been something many people would want to use for fun due to the toxicity, and even possibly from the intensity of the highs. But the effects were known, such as Pliny and Dioscorides mentioning that in small doses, it causes similar feelings to drunkenness, but in higher doses, it can cause insanity and hallucinations. Which is very true because henbane contains strong anticholinergic alkaloids, or in simple terms, it stops the neurons in your brain from working properly, so you go crazy in a state of delirium. Now, none of this proves henbane was used recreationally, but it does mean it was used enough to document the effects. But okay, I'll assume you want to try something less insanity-inducing and less likely to kill you. Perhaps you want something sweet and delicious even. Delicious sweet intoxication. And unlike some other substances I've talked about so far, mad honey is both completely legal and easy to buy online in most countries. Although some of you are probably already well aware of mad honey, since it's gone kind of viral online as this wacky mystery honey from the cliffs of the Himalayas. But this type of honey can be found naturally in a few different countries. Since the neurotoxins of the honey is derived from the nectar and pollen of a few different plants in the Rhododendron genus, including Rhododendron ponticum, which can be found in the mountains of northeastern Turkey, which I'll be trying here right now. This comes straight from the mountains of Turkey and costs $111, so you better like and subscribe for this. Luckily, I didn't actually pay for it. This was functionally sponsored by this lovely internet person. Look at that weird sticky goo slop. It has been consumed, so I'll report back when anything happens. So, it's been about 7 hours since I ate that entire 50-gram jar, and I feel nothing, but I gave 1 teaspoon to my girlfriend instead, and within 30 minutes she started laughing randomly at stuff, and became unable to speak coherently, and behaved very similar to when she's drunk. So make it that way you will. Now, the earliest clear reference to this honey comes from the 5th and 4th century BC Greek writer Xenophon of Athens in his Anabasis story, where he talks about his wacky ventures with other Greek mercenaries hired by Cyrus the Younger to overthrow his brother from the Persian throne. Now, the overall story isn't relevant here except for one small anecdote that happened when the men were in the northeastern Pontus region. In the mountainous villages, they found honey to consume, but all the men that ate it were struck down by the neurotoxins in the honey. Men that only ate a little were said to just behave really drunk, but men who ate a lot were having fits of puking and diarrhea. Luckily, by the next day, everyone recovered. Now, in Xenophon's story, the mad honey crash out was likely an accident, but we have an example of it being used as a biological weapon. If we believe our boy Strabo, then in the 60s BC, during Pompey's war in Pontus against Mithridates VI, as the Roman legions marched to the north, some of the locals intentionally left jars of mad honey around for unsuspecting legionaries to consume, and once they became too intoxicated to function, they'd be slaughtered by local forces. Supposedly, Pompey lost 3 cohorts from this honey bait, so well over 1,000 men at least. Okay, so we have Greeks and Romans getting trashed on honey because they're stupid and ate random things they found, but Pliny seemed to understand the effects were caused by the rhododendron plants of Pontus, and said it just makes people insane. He also said the region didn't generate profit from this honey, so this would suggest it was definitely not a common thing people in the regular Roman world use. And there's only a few other references to the honey, like Dioscorides randomly saying it makes people start sweating, and in On Marvelous Things Heard by Aristotle, but not really, it just says this honey makes people go insane and cures epilepsy. Now, I don't know about curing neurological disorders, but if I had to guess why they thought the honey made people crazy, it was probably because they had no idea what they were doing and almost always ate way too much of it, then started losing it. So all in all, it would seem this maddening honey was known of by the Romans, but hardly consumed by them. Although, given its different mentions throughout the centuries and quantities large enough to hammer hundreds of people at once, it was clearly being regularly produced by the locals, and therefore Roman subjects in northeastern Anatolia were definitely eating it. So shut up, it still counts. Oh wow, we did look at the time. I think we should wrap this up soon, since the substances I've listed so far are basically the ones with the best textual evidence for. Yeah, there's other psychoactive plants like mandrake or other nightshade family plants, but they're all basically identical to henbane, and most other unique substances I could list are highly speculative, like whatever was in the Eleusinian Mysteries ritual thing, but that's a whole rabbit hole itself. So instead, I'll leave you with one honorable mention, just because it's too wacky not to include: dreamfish. Since this little Mediterranean fish is known to sometimes cause psychedelic hallucinations when consumed. Now, I'm only bringing it up for 2 reasons. 1, it's a Mediterranean fish, so it's theoretically possible the Romans used it, and 2, there's a bunch of articles online describing it as an ancient Roman psychedelic and party drug. The only issue is almost none of these articles give any real sources, and the few that do just vaguely reference some French research article from 1993, which I can't even find online. So this one doesn't seem likely, but if anyone knows more about this, then please tell. And now we're finally done our questionable journey through Roman fun time substances. And who knows, if this video does well, I might take a look at other substances of other civilizations. So if you enjoyed, then be sure to like and subscribe for future projects. And with that, I'm back to the grind.